Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in today. My name is John Szymankiewicz, and I'm going to be going through a little bit of time today talking about pitfalls of buying or selling a brewery. I want to say again how much I appreciate Andrew and the folks over at Craft Beer Professionals for giving me a chance to talk to y'all today. And normally I would wear a tie for this kind of presentation, but I got this really cool shirt that I figure I'll use that today instead. So, yeah, forgive me for the casual attorney approach. So we're going to talk about buying and selling of an alcohol business, really any alcohol business, but focused on a brewery at this point. And I tell clients, I work with clients a lot on buying and selling breweries with startup breweries and so forth. And I think anybody who's watched the industry has seen we've had some consolidation in the last probably 5 to 7 years. It sort of dropped off for a little bit and it's starting to pick up again, sort of post COVID. There's a lot, I think, of breweries out there that took on some debt to survive COVID and are having trouble even servicing that debt as we come out or emerge out of COVID. And so I think there's some consolidation we're going to see there, at least some good deals on getting a hold or buying a brewery. And I think we're still going to see more consolidation even outside of that in the next 3 to 5 years as well. The market space is getting tighter. And I think my personal soapbox here is that gone are the days when you could just make good beer and have a successful brewery. You actually need to be able to run a business as well. And so I think we are seeing some folks who are, I won't say struggling with that, but for whom that market condition is becoming a challenge. So I want to talk about buying and selling because this is different. This is a lot different than if you were going to buy, I don't know, a sofa, or even if you're just going to buy like a dry cleaning business. Alcohol businesses are different. So I want to spend some time going through that today. Here's the overview of what we're actually going to talk about, a little bit about me, talk about planning. That's where most of this stuff is, where the rubber hits the road. The mechanics of the transaction. This is one I find that clients and folks aren't real comfortable with or don't kind of see how these things interact. And then what happens after closing? What happens after you buy the brewery? And I'm going to use this basically from the perspective of buying a brewery, but it's the same question or same set of questions for buying versus selling. It's two sides of the same coin. And so this is going to be for those folks looking to sell as well as folks looking to buy. And right now, I believe with interest rates where they are, even now as interest rates are going up, even now it's cheaper to buy a brewery than it is to build one. The market conditions really are just favoring some consolidation right now. And so if you're looking at opening a brewery, looking at purchasing one, you need to incorporate that into your business plan, because if you're not looking at that, you may be leaving money on the table or missing opportunities. All right. So just a little bit about me. Again, my name is John Szymankiewicz. I'm part of Beer Law Center. I come to the law as career 2.0. I was an engineer for 15 or so years before I went to law school. I tell people it took me a good 10 years to figure out I didn't like engineering. And then so I went to law school. And since law school, I've basically dedicated my career to the craft beverage industry. I've been doing exclusively alcohol law for a little over 10 years now. And then, not only is this something that I do for a living, it's something I enjoy. This is kind of a passion for me. Recently passed my BJCP exam, certified Cicerone, and I've even started doing some wine work just for fun. So that's a little bit about me. The firm, we are a small firm. There's 2 attorneys and 1 paralegal in Beer Law Center. We are part of a slightly larger firm, but we are, kind of, I won't say insulated, but we're on our own. Nobody knows what we do and in our part of the firm. So that makes life kind of interesting. All right. So pitfall number 1, failure to plan. And this comes down, I think, to some part of understanding the issues, understanding the transaction and what you're doing, but failing to plan, especially enough time to plan, is going to come back and bite you. And that's whether you're a seller or a buyer. So what are those things? One, have you budgeted appropriately how much time this is going to take? Do you know how this is actually going to happen? How are we going to transfer assets? How are we going to change the utilities over from one name to another? What are we going to do with the employees? All those sorts of things. What are the mechanics actually look like of how this stuff works? And then folks, especially buyers coming into this who don't understand the business. If you're a brewery with a tap room, you're really running two businesses, right? You're running a manufacturing operation that's making beer, and you're running a bar to sell product over the tap room, over the counter, over the bar. That's what I kept trying to say. So you're running two businesses. If you do either one of them badly, you're going to tank everything. I've worked with clients before where, okay, I want to start a brewery, but I'm going to do it as a brew pub. And my first question to them is, okay, do you have any restaurant experience? Well, no. All right, then you need to find somebody that does, because if you're doing that food, that's a third business, right? And all these pieces have to work together. So that understanding of the business is key. And there's my statement about this isn't like buying a sofa or other some kind of business. There are a lot of pieces here. You've got the business itself, you've got the regulatory aspect, and liability that we need to worry about that is probably fairly unique to the alcohol industry. So, okay, what is that timeline? What does that planning look like? And I said, all right, if you have everything lined up, you've got your financing, you've got your company, you've got everything that you're going to do, you're ready to go. I'm ready to write a check tomorrow for this brewery. You better be planning on a 60-day turnaround time. Because just to get that purchase agreement, and we'll talk through these mechanisms, that purchase agreement, due diligence, and to get the closing done, it's going to take some time, right? And if you haven't already done the due diligence, you want to build some due diligence time in there where you can figure out whether there are any poison pills or hiding issues here. And again, if you're financing this transaction, or if there's a finance company involved at all, plan for more time. Okay, the due diligence, and of course, things are going to happen. What happens if somebody gets sick, or has to isolate for COVID or something like that, and you lose a few days in your path. So you need to build in some time. I had, at a push, I've closed a business purchase in about 30 days, but that was a real struggle. That was, lawyers going back and forth with how to ironing out the purchase agreement, getting the financing and getting money transferred out of other people's accounts, or money, collected money. And then that whole bit. And that was a struggle. So at least 60 days, preferably 90 or more if you've got some financing involved. I have not seen the SBA close on a loan in less than 60 to 90 days, period. So build in that time if you're going to do that. More on planning. And here's another piece I want to talk about. And it's understanding, again, pitfall number 2, what the heck are you buying? So there are two basic kinds of transactions here. Are you buying the assets of the company, right? The stuff, the tanks, the chairs, the name. The name is a thing. You can buy the name from them, the trademarks. Or are you buying the company? Right? Those are two very different things. The one I always think about here is if I'm representing the seller, as a seller, I want you to buy the company. If I'm a buyer, I want to buy the assets. And here's the main difference from a lawyer's point of view. When you buy the company exists, right? The company is like a separate person. So if you're buying the company, you're just trading places with the owners of that company. That's still the same company that's been operating it this whole time. Well, that also means when you buy that company, you're also buying all that company's past liability. If they'd had tax problems in the past, that company still owes those taxes. If there was an employment law issue, God forbid somebody, sexually harassed a taproom employee, well, they've got 3 years to come back and sue the company. for something like that. So even if that happened 2 years ago, you buy the company, you may still end up with that lawsuit a year from now and still have to pay that out, right? So if you buy the company, you're assuming all of those liabilities as well. If you are buying the assets, that cuts off that liability. You're only buying the things at that point. But that also means it's a brand new company, right? Which may cause you some financing issues, right? You don't have any track record as producing this place or producing this product and running this business at this location. So there are advantages to both, right? If I buy the company, it makes some of the licensing a little bit easier. If I buy the assets, well, I can shed a lot of liability and start with a clean slate so that all the liability I have is stuff that's in my control. So there's some real things you want to think about, but those two, or that decision is going to drive the entire rest of the process. As is, how are you paying for this? Pitfall number 3, not planning enough time for the SBA or your lender to close. I've had a couple of clients go, oh yeah, we can close in 30 days. We can get the money, no problem. We got the purchase agreement together and it took about, a week to 2 weeks to get the purchase agreement together. And that's when they went to the SBA or to their bank to get money. Like, are you kidding me? I thought you did that months ago. And sure enough, as soon as he said that, they said, oh, there's no way we can close on this loan for at least another 90 days. All right, now we got to go back and rewrite the purchase agreement. We've got to redo some things here because, again, the seller thought they were getting out in 30 days, and you just held them to the fire another 60 days potentially. Pitfall number 4: are there other loans already on the business? Right? If they have loans, particularly like an EIDL or just a equipment loan or leases, there are liens against that equipment. Those have to be paid off at the closing, especially if you're buying assets. If you're buying the company, then the guarantees might have to change because, again, somebody probably personally guaranteed that loan and that person's not there anymore. So if there's other loans on that business or on those assets, you need to be aware of those and you need to plan for those. And secondly, how are you organized as a company? And what I mean by that is whether or not you're an LLC or a corporation doesn't matter. Well, I mean, it matters, but for this part, it doesn't matter. What I'm worried about is you, Mr. Buyer, or you, Mr. Seller, do you have the authority to do what you want to do? So for example, if I look at one of my clients' bylaws, they're a corporation, they've got bylaws, and it says that any purchase or sale of the assets of the company over a certain dollar amount has to be approved by a shareholder vote. And it has a threshold on that, not just a simple majority. It's got to be approved by like an 80% majority. All right. Have you had that discussion? Have you informed your other shareholders? Do you have business partners out there? Do you have silent business partners? Do they need to approve this thing before you can actually sign any of the documents, right? Whether that's a letter of intent or anything else. So that's another one you need to be worried about. And that pitfall number 5, what about operation of the business after closing? Or excuse me, until closing. Recently had this issue come up with a client where in the weeks before closing, from the time they had the purchase agreement to the time they closed, they said, well, we've got a really good deal on grain and some hops have come up, so we're going to increase our inventory. And they bought an extra $20,000 of inventory. And then at the closing, there was a true up or a bringing money to the table. Okay, you pay for the active inventory, the work in progress. And the buyer's like, where the hell did this other $20,000 come from? Well, we went ahead and bought enough grain for you for the next month and a half. And the buyer's like, okay, well, thanks, but I wasn't expecting another $20,000 on this. Don't do that. And we had to have a conversation about what does that mean? Why did you do that? And do the buyers really need to buy all that inventory? How the business is run from the time of that purchase agreement up till closing is going to affect the business after that. If you've got a seller that's trying to get out as soon as possible, hey, there better be commitments as to how many hours you're open, what kind of beer you're making, how you're treating your kegs, all that stuff that's going to affect the value of the business that could tank or at least go down in that period of time. All right, moving on. And I apologize, I'm running through this really fast. I've got about 30, 45 minutes to chat with y'all today. And I could talk about this stuff for hours. So I'm going to kind of run through things pretty quickly and hopefully have some time for questions and answers. But if you have any questions after this, feel free to reach out to me. Happy always to talk about this. So let's talk about the mechanics of a transaction. What actually is going to happen here? Find a brewery or a buyer, right? If you're a seller, I got to find a buyer. If I'm a buyer, I've got to find a brewery that I want to buy. Then you're going to enter into some sort of high-level negotiation and a letter of intent, right? Do you have to have a letter of intent? No, you don't. And generally, letters of intent are non-binding, but they do lay out some basic terms. And if you have a letter of intent, that's what I or somebody like me is going to use to build that purchase agreement. The letter of intent is going to outline basically, how much are we talking about? How much money? What are you doing in transition time or training? What about the employees? What specific things are being sold or not sold? And what sort of general timeline are we looking at? So you're going to enter into that negotiation. Nothing matters as long as it's a non-binding letter of intent. I have very rarely, but occasionally seen binding letters of intent. So do watch out for those. But if it's a non-binding letter of intent, nothing matters until that purchase agreement. And that purchase agreement, 1, please don't use a generic form online. 2, please don't use a generic form online. 3, don't use a form online. That purchase agreement is going to outline what's being sold, who's buying what, who's responsible for what claims might be on there, who's going to indemnify, who's going to protect the buyer or the seller from claims, how is the business going to be run in between the purchase agreement and the closing, what the responsibilities of each party are. Even for a simple purchase, that purchase agreement, I haven't seen less than about 15 or 20 pages. There's a lot of detail in there that needs to be very clear, because what we don't want to do is spend several $100,000 to buy a brewery and then, a month later argue about who bought what, or what did they actually buy. And, oh no, you didn't get the website, or you don't get the trademark name. That's mine. I keep it. Well, wait a minute. I thought I was getting that. That purchase agreement is incredibly important and incredibly detailed. If you have an attorney for no other part of this, get an attorney that hopefully understands the alcohol industry and the regulatory stuff, and get help on that purchase agreement. That will save you pain and money and effort in the long term. All right, enough about the purchase agreement. So after the purchase agreement is signed, remember, that purchase agreement is not the purchase. That is a promise to purchase. And it's just like buying a house. You get a contract to purchase real estate, and it says, okay, here's all the terms, and we're going to purchase it. We're going to close on X date, 30 days from now, or end of the month, or whatever it is. That's exactly the same for buying a brewery or any business. The purchase agreement is the promise to purchase. Now, after that, just like buying a house, when you sign the agreement and say, okay, now I'm going to go get a home inspector to go check the place out, make sure that, the roof isn't going to fall in, the foundation isn't subsiding. You're going to do the same thing with buying a brewery, and it's called due diligence. It's at that point that if I'm the buyer, I want the seller I want to see their QuickBooks. I want to see their employee files. I want to see their lease. I want to see I want to do an inspection of their equipment. I want to know their keg inventory. I want to know their turnaround time. I want to know their retail accounts, if they're self-distributing. That's the point where, as the seller, I have to lay out my entire business. I have to share all of my information, so that the buyer can figure out whether or not there is any latent or hiding liability, hiding booby traps, or landmines, that sort of stuff, where you go, okay, so my example earlier is for example, the employees, hey, I looked at your employee files. It says here that this person reported being sexually harassed last year. Did you do anything about that? No. All right. So that's a problem. There's some liability here, and that can affect how much I'm willing to pay for that business, right? If I now know that, well, there's like a 10, 20, maybe a 50% chance the company is going to get sued for $500,000 next year, I'm a little less likely to buy a company for, $500,000, as opposed to I don't have to worry about some of that liability if I'm just buying the assets. So again, those are some of the things you want to think about and dive into those details in due diligence. This is also the period, if you're the buyer, you're lining up your financing. That is, the underwriters are getting this, you're getting your closing checklist together, personal guarantees on a loan, all that sort of stuff, so that at closing, that's when the money changes hands. That's when, somebody signs a check or does a wire transfer, and I, as the seller, say, okay, here are the keys to the building. Here's my password. Here are the business passwords for social media and the website. Here's all my information to get the utilities transferred. That's at the point where everything changes hands, is at that closing. And that draws a line in the sand. From that point forward, it's the buyer's responsibility. From that point previously, it's the seller's responsibility. And so that's really, really important based on what may have happened right before or right after that closing, right? So, for example, as a brewery, I've got a keg out in circulation, and it's bad keg, right? It's leaked, it's gone sour, something's funky with it. Retail says, take this back. Okay, so who has to give credit for that keg, right? If it went out before closing, it's technically the seller's responsibility. If it went out after closing, it's the buyer's responsibility, even if it was brewed before closing, right? So we have to worry about when that happened, and those kinds of liability questions are going to be addressed back in that purchase agreement. So again, that's hugely important. All right. And here's sort of why that's important. There's a lot of moving pieces in that purchase agreement. And it's going to sort of drive everything else. That interrelatedness of this purchase agreement and all the things that work together is pitfall number 6, right? Which is, if you're not planning on or not thinking about how all these things work together, okay, so you're going to buy a brewery. Does that brewery already have distribution agreements in place with wholesalers? Okay, so you take that business subject to those agreements. You don't get to get out of those agreements in most cases. Okay, you've got financing. Well, financing is going to drive when you can close, when you can buy it, maybe even what you can buy and how much money you have to bring to the table. Your lease and real estate, well, you can't actually be in that spot even if you own the equipment, even if you bought the company. Well, I take that back. If you bought the company, the lease was probably in the company's name, but I guarantee you the landlord is going to ask what happened to the person who was guaranteeing or had a personal guarantee on that lease. So it's updating and being aware of all of these pieces, how they fit together, and so how everybody is more or less protected. So we're going to dive a little bit, and I think I'm almost on time, into more of the mechanics. So like the little chart I showed earlier, documents drive the process. What are the documents? Well, there's a letter of intent. It's optional, it's not required, but it sets the stage, right? Purchase agreement, again, not the purchase, it's a promise to purchase, and forgetting that is pitfall number 7. And then pitfall number 8 is your closing documents. It's not just we sign the purchase agreement and then on the 1st of May, I give you a check and you give me the stuff. No, wait a minute. Unlike a car, unlike a house, there's no title document for personal property for that fermenter. Who owns that bright tank? Well, it's installed in my damn brewery. I think it's me. So we have to create documents there. The bill of sale, everybody knows what that is. That's hey, I'm selling this, you're buying that. Here, I got the money and everything's fine. Well, now I want a separate document that says, oh, by the way, if I'm buying the assets, here's all the assets that I'm buying. And as the seller, I sign, I no longer have a claim on any of these things. I've given these to buyer, right? So that, somebody, for example, a finance company comes back later and says, no, wait a minute, we're going to repossess that tank because y'all didn't finish paying on it. No, it's mine, and this person gave it to me in fee simple, with no liens attached. There's no liens recorded, so you got to go back after them for that, because I own this, not the company, not those turkeys that you actually had the agreement with. Those kind of things. A receipt, gosh, that'd be nice. What I call evidence of approval, and that's that situation where my bylaws or my operating agreement for the company says this has to be approved by X many people, or by the members or by the shareholders. If those things are required and it's not approved, the seller can come in, or the company can come in and undo the entire transaction, because that person who signed off on it didn't have the authority to do what they were doing. A management agreement, I'll come back to that in just a second. If necessary, most times something like that will be necessary, and then a release. And when I say what a release is there, it's a buyer and seller agree at closing that we've done everything we said we would do. There are a couple things that we're gonna do later, but everything we said that we would do before closing has been done, and there's nothing outstanding that was supposed to be done. Again, just one of those, no, I did everything I was supposed to do, this is your problem, or vice versa. And my comment to clients a lot is, you're investing a lot of money in this stuff. You wouldn't buy a house for a couple $100,000 without signing 18 sheets of paper. You're not going to do it here for a business either. Expect to have documentation, and a lot of documentation. And quite frankly, what I tend to tell folks is the amount of documentation is proportional to the risk, which is your money, right? Spend time and have more documentation and more paper, for $1 million brewery than for a $50,000 brewery, right? Those kinds of questions. All right. Post-closing, pitfall number 9. How do you stay in production? Generally speaking, licenses are non-transferable. Specifically, federal licenses are not transferable. Your TTB license is non-transferable if you are selling the assets. If you are selling the company, then it's a change of ownership. But if you are selling the assets, that change of ownership doesn't apply. If you sell the assets of the company, that buyer has to go through an entirely new TTB application. And this is going to vary state to state on what they will let you do or how they will let that continue. And here's one option that I've worked with in North Carolina, Virginia, and West Virginia. Is I refer to this as a leaseback operations agreement. And that situation is, I'm selling the assets as a seller. I'm going to sell the assets to buyer. Buyer is going to immediately lease those assets back to me. And then I'm going to hire the buyer to provide labor to manage the day-to-day operations, to brew beer, to run the tap room, all that sort of stuff under my oversight. And what happens then is, buyer, in order to be compensated for the lease and the providing labor, Mr. Buyer, you're going to take all the profits. Whatever money comes in the door, that belongs to you, except the excise taxes. The excise taxes you have to pay to me because we're still using my permit. It's technically my brewery still. I'm just paying you to run it. And I still have to pay those on my pay.gov site and my state Department of Revenue tax site. So we're going to keep running like that. You basically have autonomy for the brewery while you go get your TTB and ABC permits. And then this agreement, this leaseback operations agreement, automatically terminates when you get your permits. So once the buyer has received his permits, which can take 60, 90 days, some states take a tremendously long time to get approved. Whatever that is, we can keep running under this agreement. And then once you get your permits approved, the agreement terminates. Everything should be at that point under buyer. Seller wipes their hands and backs away, says, okay, I'm not doing anything for this brewery anymore. But that's how you can, one way you can keep operations running from the time that you purchase something, which technically your permit should expire at that point, whether it's buying the business or the assets. But that's one way you can kind of extend that operation so you continue to cover overhead until you get permitted as your new entity, if that's what you're doing. Okay, more stuff post-closing. So at the closing, you get the keys, I get the money, great. But then there's this whole list of other stuff that has to happen now. Are you reusing the same POS? Are you using a new POS? If this is a new company, I've got to get new supplier agreements. You know, if suppliers are extending you credit, it's a new credit app. How are we dealing with the employees and payroll? What about transferring over utilities? You know, if I'm new to the business, is the seller going to help, train me on the business for some period of time? All of that is going to happen post-closing. So not having a post-closing plan, or, and I've seen this happen, burning a bridge with a buyer or seller, is pitfall number 10. If you just absolutely scorched earth, scrape every dime out of this buyer that you possibly can, leave them holding the bag on everything, well, they're less likely to be able to want to work with you as things come up, right? Where, no, we're not going to pay that. That accounts receivable or that accounts payable is under your name, not ours. Good luck with that, right? Those issues, or more frequently, the other side of that, if the buyer has burned that bridge with a seller, oh, that's going to be a lot tougher, because sometimes you need approval from them to get utilities changed over, or those supplier agreements, those sort of things. So that's the other one you got to be very, very careful about. I'm going to jump out of the presentation. Here's our information, who we are, and so forth. I'm going to jump out of these slides so I can see the chat and hopefully get a chance to answer any questions, concerns that y'all may have. Stop that. Let's see. I don't see too many. Oh, there's a whole bunch of questions. Let's see here. Tie-in cases. So Fred says, selling a New Jersey brewery, and I know I'm not licensed in New Jersey. Yes, I'll be happy to send you a referral for an attorney in New Jersey. There are not many of us that actually do this for a living. And so we all kind of know each other. I've got a couple folks out that way that I can shoot you a link to. If you don't mind, because I don't necessarily have your email, would you shoot me just an email? I'm at john@beerlawcenter.com, just JOHN @beerlawcenter.com. To remind me of that, I'll be happy to do that for you. Any other questions anybody has, about this or life in general, whatever, I'm available. But otherwise, I think we're all set. Sorry if I ran through things quickly. I'll make the slides available on the YouTube page that this is always going to go up on. Appreciate that, Andrew, as well, for making that available to everyone. And I think we're about 35 minutes. So I went over a little bit. Hope I didn't lose too many folks. But again, appreciate y'all giving me the chance to talk with you today. Hope you learned something. Hope it wasn't too boring. And if you have any questions, drop me a line, shoot me an email. Always happy to chat, even if I send you somewhere else to another attorney. All right. Thanks again, y'all. Have a great day.